Famous Women of the Abolitionist and Women's Suffrage Movements by Mrs. Price's 4th grade class, November 5th, 2013. Let's first learn about Harriet Tubman, an abolitionist and conductor of the Underground Railroad.
Harriet Tubman, originally named Araminta Ross, was born on March 10, 1821 in Maryland on a slave plantation. Throughout her early life, she worked as a servant girl inside of her master's home. One day when she was a teenager, she was hit in the head with a weight when she tried to defend a fellow slave who was being beaten for some trivial matter. Due to the shock of the blow that was inflicted upon her, for the rest of her life, Tubman was prone to fainting spells. As she grew older, Harriet Tubman developed an intense fear that the family she belonged to was going to sell her to other slave owners, and so she developed a plan to escape, despite knowing that she would be killed if she were caught in the act of running away. In 1849, Tubman began her journey north, using the North Star as her guide. Along the way, she stayed with many Quaker families, who opened up their homes to her along the way. Eventually, Harriet Tubman made it to the land of the free and settled in Pennsylvania, where she obtained a job. After working for 2 years in Philadelphia, Harriet Tubman decided to return to Maryland and to retrieve her mother and sister, and later her father and her brother. The route that she took was the same one she had used to escape from her master, and it became known as the Underground Railroad. Harriet Tubman began doing the same for other slaves, such that by 1856, a $40,000 reward was being offered to any bounty hunter who could catch her. However, the conductor of the Underground Railroad could not be caught. By 1860, Harriet Tubman had led over 19 journeys on the Underground Railroad, granting close to 300 slaves their freedom. Aside from serving as the leader of the Underground Railroad, Harriet Tubman also served as a nurse during the Civil War, as well as a cook and a Union spy. Tubman lived long enough to see the day when the slaves were officially released from their bondage through the Emancipation Proclamation. At the age of 92, Harriet Tubman passed away peacefully in her home in Troy, a city in New York. She will always be remembered for her bravery and for her contributions to the abolitionist movement.
Now let's hear a little bit about Elizabeth Cady Stanton, one of the early pioneers of the women's suffrage movement.
Elizabeth Cady Stanton was born on November 12, 1815 in New York. As a child, she attended the prestigious Johnston Academy, and later she studied French, Latin, Greek, mathematics, science, and religion at Emma Willard's Troy Female Seminary. When Elizabeth Cady Stanton had finished her schooling in 1839, she went to visit members of her extended family, where she met Henry Brewster Stanton, an abolitionist who would become her husband 1 year later. As a married couple, the Stantons were part of an elite social group and counted Louisa May Alcott, the author of Little Women, and the poet Ralph Waldo Emerson among their dearest friends. While Elizabeth Cady Stanton tended to her 7 children, she befriended the Grimke sisters, Angela and Sarah, as well as Lucretia Mott, all of whom were seeking equal rights for women. In 1848, Elizabeth Cady Stanton organized the first large-scale women's rights convention, in which she declared that women and men should be equal before the law, and that women, therefore, should have the right to vote. Stanton also called for the end to women's taxation without representation. By 1851, Stanton had joined forces with Susan B. Anthony, another major figure in the women's suffrage movement, and by 1860 their efforts led the state of New York to bestow widows with the same rights as men. With the ratification of the 14th and 15th Amendments to the United States Constitution, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony and other suffrage leaders argued that these amendments provide evidence for women's right to vote. While Elizabeth Cady Stanton died at the age of 87 in 1902, 18 years before women were granted the right to vote, Stanton is remembered as an early pioneer of the women's suffrage movement, as she encouraged other women to fight the good fight and demand equal treatment before the law.
Finally, let's conclude our talk with the story of Sojourner Truth, a famous woman who is both an abolitionist and a women's rights activist.
Isabella Baumfree, later known by the name of Sojourner Truth, was born in 1797 in New York. After having served 5 masters as a slave, Truth was freed from slavery with the passing of the New York Anti-Slavery Act of 1827, which outlawed the possession of slaves in the state of New York. After she was freed from the bondage of slavery, she lived with a Quaker family where she developed a love for religion and public speaking. It was during this period in her life that Sojourner Truth began to speak publicly about the horrors of slavery and about her desire for slavery to be stopped in all states. In 1848, Truth was a featured speaker at the Women's Rights Convention that had been organized primarily by Elizabeth Cady Stanton. At the convention, Truth delivered her famous speech entitled "Ain't I a Woman?" that spoke not only on behalf of white women's right to vote, but black women's right to vote as well. In 1857, Truth moved to Battle Creek, Michigan, where she continued to advocate for the freedom of slaves and for women's equal treatment before the law. After the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, she met with President Abraham Lincoln, and she even devised a plan that called for giving recently freed slaves land in the western part of the United States, even though her plan never materialized into reality. Sojourner Truth died in 1883 at the age of 86, and will always be remembered for her contributions to both the abolitionist and women's suffrage movements.